Hey there, welcome to the Stream Home Edition. I'm Josh Rushing, and we are live from my home today. Today we're talking about the race for a vaccine for COVID-19 and the novel coronavirus. First, I want to bring out that this is going out live on YouTube. And so what I want you to do if you're watching on YouTube is join us in that YouTube chat over there. Give me some questions to ask, questions for our panelists today. We'll get you engaged in the discussion. Now, we're talking about COVID-19. We're looking at, so far, more than 13 million cases worldwide. And this is astounding. More than 573,000 deaths. And how long has this been around? Maybe what, 6-7 months? Yesterday, we were looking at 200,000 new cases in the world with about, and then depending on when you see this, so about 200,000 new cases in the world today right now, and about 3,700 deaths a day. 3,700 deaths a day. There is no cure for it. And the best hope out is a vaccine. Now, this is I want to share with you a comment from a doctor who's in our community, Dr. Amir Khan. Here, check this out.
Patients are often asking me about when a vaccine is going to become available because they understand that it's the only way really to defeat this virus. They do get mixed messages online about when it might be coming out, about who will be eligible for it, and that does make them anxious. So we do have to deal with that. For me as a primary care doctor, having a vaccine would mean everything. I wouldn't have to consult in PPE, which creates a barrier between me and my patients. I'd be able to get on with routine work, diabetic clinics, asthma clinics, all these things that have been put on hold can get back to being done, and also planning for the future, the flu clinics in the winter. There are so many ifs and maybes around, and a vaccine would just help give us a definitive answer.
So as Dr. Khan said there, having a vaccine would mean everything. Here's the rub. Let's show you my computer real quick. How long will the vaccine really take? If you look at the typical timeline that includes research, preclinical, 3 different phases of trials, the building the factories, manufacturing, approval, and distribution, we could have this vaccine out by, and here's what I really want you to see, if you can see my mouse there, May 2036. Who's ready to stay in quarantine for the next 16 years? So here's the goal. We're going to crunch down this entire timeline, which has never been done before, to try to get it out on this timeline by August 2021. Now, the difference between this and this is everything this show is about today. Because when you move that red line that far that way, that fast, what you mean is you're taking a lot of risk. You're taking a lot of risk with people's lives. But when you leave this line out this far, at this rate, today, 3,800 dead a day, and that number will grow. So, which is the safest way? What do we do? Well, when you crunch this down, there are loads of questions about how to most ethically do that. And that's what we want to talk about today with our exciting panel of 3 doctors. And I'm going to have each doctor introduce themselves. I want to begin with Dr. Anant Bhan. Hey, Dr. Bhan, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Josh, for having me. So my name is Anant Bhan. I am based in Bhopal in central India, and I am a researcher in global health, bioethics, and health policy. A pleasure to be on the show.
We're happy to have you, Dr. Bhan. All right, Dr. Saira Madad.
Thanks for having me, Josh. So I'm Saira Madad. I serve as the Senior Director for the Systemized Special Pathogens Program for a very large healthcare system in New York City. I'm also a fellow and part of the COVID-19 task force for the Federation of American Scientists, and I'm happy to join you all.
Oh, yeah, thanks for being here. And Dr. Nir Ayal.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm a bioethicist and the director of Rutgers University's Center for Population Level Bioethics.
All right, great. And this is as much for my mom as the audience. In a pre-show discussion, we agreed we're going to go by first names here. Otherwise, I would call them by their proper name, but this is going to make it a little easier, a little faster. Saira, can we start with you? What kind of testing does it take to develop a new vaccine and get it to the people? There are 2 basic options, right? Efficacy testing and human challenge. Can you set that up for us?
That's right. So, you have, as you've mentioned, I think the big debate right now is the human challenge, getting those trials up and running. There's a lot of controversy, ethical and philosophical issues that go along with it. You have kind of the normal route where you are able to inoculate individuals and then naturally they get the disease through their environment. Through the human challenge, they're purposely and intentionally basically, exposed to the virus, and that exposes and brings up a lot of different issues. I think the first thing, probably just to quickly mention, is that we don't have a treatment and we don't have, a golden standard intervention for COVID-19. So when individuals are, doing informed consent of being, participating in these types of trials, we still don't know the full picture of the risks that are being taken. We don't know the sequelae of the disease. And we also know that not just the overall biological factors that go along with, being susceptible to the disease, you also have the socioeconomic and the racial disparities. So we have to be very careful when it comes to those types of things. And so I think that there's a lot of different factors, a lot of different issues to obviously discuss, a lot of them that deal with ethical implications, the philosophical implications as we talk about just medicine in general. But I think that at the end of the day, it's just a lot about the risk and benefit analysis. And certainly we are in the biggest race of our life in terms of developing a vaccine for this century. And this is something that is on the minds of everybody. That certainly we really need to obviously just see what exactly is on the table right now.
But not when I hear that we're talking about testing where we intentionally infect people with a disease that has no cure. The big question for me is who's going to do that? How do we pick who does that? 3 tests I'm aware of at this moment, I think, are looking at Brazil, South Africa, and India. The Brazil and South Africa tests are part of an Oxford study, and India is a biomedical company leading the study there. Can you talk to me about the ethics of who would get infected with this?
Sure. So as you described, there are more than 155 vaccine candidates as of current count, which are in the fray. And part of the challenge, as you also showed in the timeline, is how do we get to a vaccine as soon as possible, given the kind of mortality and morbidity that we are seeing. There are multiple companies, multiple research groups in the fray. One way of trying to collapse that timeline is certain challenge studies, as was described. But challenge studies also, have been around for a while, but are typically done in disease conditions where we have some fair characterization and a good understanding of the disease. In the case of COVID-19, our own understanding of the disease is evolving. I mean, we still don't know many things about the disease, its pathophysiology, its impact, its longer-term impact on patients, and the sequelae of the disease. Part of that is the current discussion around airborne transmission, for example, which we have been having over the last couple of weeks. So we don't really know enough about the disease. So in the past, it's been done for it's been used for disease conditions like cholera, malaria, probably also talked about for typhoid, where we at least have definitive treatment available, as Sarah was alluding to. But here in COVID-19, we only have symptomatic treatment. We don't have definitive efficacy therapeutics available yet, at least not which is globally established as standard of care. So the real question then is it worth putting people at risk by intentionally infecting them? Because that is what is at the core of doing human challenge studies. And if yes, what do you need to do to ensure that you're protecting those who would be participating in these studies? You also alluded to the fact that who would actually be participating in the studies. That's a good question. If these are studies to be conducted by, say, Oxford University, but to be done in low and middle income countries like Brazil, China, India, South Africa, then what kind of power structures are we talking about? What kind of collaborative structures are we talking about? Part of what we need to discuss is, do we have the right infrastructure to run these studies? And if not, where should they be run? And what kind of protection should we have to ensure that no one is exploited and that these are done in a safe manner while minimizing our risk?
Nir, you've actually argued for these tests, right?
Correct.
How do you do them safely?
You have to apply the highest standards of informed consent, of risk minimization, and that includes primarily selecting people who are young and healthy. So without the preconditions that predict worse COVID outcomes. So if people get infected, they are likely not to experience severe outcomes. If you look at the general population, among people in their 20s, the risk of dying from COVID infection are commensurate with those of kidney donation, which is a practice that we all accept, not because it's healthy somehow for the kidney donor, but because of what it does to one other person. Only in this case, we're talking about trials that would help us avoid a global calamity that affects economically, especially livelihoods in developing countries. Colleagues and I have work in progress where we calculate how, just set aside the life years saved by even 1 month of expediting the arrival of a vaccine. We're talking about 40 million years in poverty averted worldwide, 34 million of which are in developing countries. You avert this for any 1 month that you expedite the arrival of a vaccine. And importantly, even if very unjustly, very inequitably, the vaccine is initially available in high-income countries. So you basically rely on people's informed consent. You tell them, just as we do for kidney donation, are you willing to help us? Are you willing to be very altruistic and help us and take on some risk for the sake of a wider community? You minimize the risk. I think once you do it right, and of course it would have to abide by the highest standards, once you do it right, it's intolerable. I don't like the risk. I wish we already had a therapy that would, rescue therapy that would ensure that there would be much less risk. Even before we have that, I think it's already at an acceptable level. If we do everything right, we must do it right.
Nir, I want to bring in someone who's actually volunteering or volunteered for the risk. His name is Thomas Smiley, and he's part of a movement called One Day Sooner. Guys, can we pull up Thomas's bite? And I want to share this with the audience.
I wanted to volunteer for this because I see a great need for expediting all this. Every day I turn on the news, it's something worse and worse. The problem is not getting any better. I want to do something to help. I've lived and loved and danced and had all these great times. There are people that need more help than I do. I need to do something. And if that costs me this much, but we get this much, it seems like a no-brainer.
First, I got to say, Thomas has a voice that would convince me to take it, the test. But the question here is you say, let's target the younger population. They have a lower risk of dying so far. But what do we really know about the long-term impact COVID has on the organs of younger people? Have there been studies on that?
This is really a question for the doctor in the group, but I'll say as a bioethicist, if you look at the risk of hospitalization, it's a very rough predictor of how many people there will be with the level of complications that might develop into long-term morbidities. And even there, I think that what we're talking about still meets standards for maximal risk in medical studies. Again, this is not something we like. We wish we knew more about it, but if you are fair towards people and if the informed consent says things like, look, we don't even know what exactly the risks are, take it or leave it, so to speak. This is it. There is real risk for you. We then verify comprehension. Did you understand this? Tell me what I told you. Do we know the level of risk? Do we know exactly what? If we verify that people comprehend, this is the general standard that we use in medical studies.
So, sorry, how do you do that? How do you do that in countries where there's really high poverty risk? Are you preying on people's desperation if they even understand the risk involved?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think first, what we know about COVID-19 is it's not the great equalizer as people often think. No one is immune, no one is invincible. So even if we are looking at, doing these Kellam studies in those that are healthy, those that are in the youth, if you look at the data, about, for example, in the United States, less than 10% of those that are in the ages of 25 and 54 have died of COVID-19. But there's also a lot of different factors and changes. So if you look at a given population, a given community, particularly here, for example, in the United States, we have a high level of obesity, diabetes, hypertension, even in the youth, right? These are really big problems. People that, smoke, that puts them at higher risk of having a more severe illness of COVID-19. So even if you are targeting people that are healthy, that have no underlying health conditions, there's a big difference of what we're seeing, even in the health disparities and the racial disparities. So we have to be very careful, especially when we're looking at doing some of these studies in other countries that obviously are low income. But I think one of the things that I would really like to highlight is while we're talking about obviously developing vaccines, the really big issue that we're going to start seeing is the manufacturing and then being able to distribute these vaccines. We don't know what the supply chain is going to look like behind it. Already we're seeing a huge implication to supply chain just in our day-to-day lives and as healthcare providers, from PPE to having enough reagents for doing diagnostic testing. I can't imagine that once these vaccines are actually available, is it going to require a booster shot? Does it have to be refrigerated? How many people can actually get it in the beginning? And so these are all these things that need to be discussed now. And we need to have a very robust educational campaign. And one of the things that I think Taiwan and South Korea have been doing so well is informing the general public. Here, for example, in certain parts of the world, and particularly in the United States, there's so much politics involved that people now are hesitant to get vaccinated. If you look at the World Health Organization, vaccine hesitancy is actually one of the top 10 global health threats that we have. So we really need to make sure that we're starting to educate the general public now in terms of this is why it's important to get vaccinated, because if we try to obviously get to that herd immunity level through vaccination, we're looking at least 2023, 2024, even with a perfect accelerated timeline. So we really need to make sure that we're starting to really discuss the importance of getting vaccinated and providing some of the education and the facts behind it now.
Do we even know, though, is herd immunity even possible? Or are we certain of that?
There's a lot of controversy, but certainly I think based on the foundation, based on what we know about viruses and based on what we know about microbes in general, there's obviously a controversy of how much, what is the threshold of herd immunity for COVID-19. I've seen everything from 20% to, as high as 70%. So there's a big variability between the two. But I think at the end of the day, it's obviously going to vary on the community and the location and the geographical area. But I think the core tenets is the same. You want to make sure that you're looking at the community, you're educating the community, and you're looking at what are some of the disparities, what are some of the health outcomes within that community. Is it high obesity, high diabetes, things like that you really want to start addressing?
So I want to bring in a comment from our community. Beatrice Tome is a doctor down in Sao Paulo, and she talks about how you can engage community ethically. Do we have that?
I believe one of the key challenges in conducting research in settings for COVID-19, in settings such as Brazil, is how to meaningfully engage communities, not only during the recruitment phase of the research endeavor, but also during the design of the trials, how the procedures will go about. And in particular, if we think about that in such settings, these communities might be the hardest hit by the pandemic because of their inherent vulnerabilities. We need to be able to listen to their voices and address such specificities.
Anant, how do we make sure, because you mentioned the power structures before in your first answer, how do we make sure that it isn't poor people of color that this is being tested on, and then access to it is wealthier people, white people, essentially?
Absolutely. And I think that reinforces one of the key elements in ethics, which is the importance of both public engagement and community engagement. I've spent time in South Africa also looking at this issue in the context of HIV vaccine trials. This has also come up in microbicide trials, etc. Communities can have a huge backlash around biomedical intervention if they feel that they are being exploited, or if they feel that it's not in their interest. So anywhere from feeling that they're being deliberately infected to that here is the white scientist coming in and experimenting on our bodies is something which has led to a lot of controversy in the past. It's in our best interest, hence, to keep all of that in mind and then work on a strategy which at the base of it ensures that there is an understanding with the communities that we work in, which we want to target for our vaccine trials, for them to understand why we are doing it, how we are doing it, and what kind of protections are we building in. In the absence of that, we risk actually enhancing the vaccine hesitancy sentiment, which Sarah alluded to, and that is going to be a major issue, because that will not just push back COVID-19 science, it could potentially push back all forms of research and also impact any agreement towards being willing to take a vaccine as and when it becomes available. That might not be a risk worth taking given the implications that will have on any kind of health outcomes. So it's extremely important to get the individuals, the community leaders in these communities we want to work involved and make them understand that this is something that we want to partner with them on, and this is not meant to come in and experiment on them in any way. And that's where I think the involvement of local scientific organizations and research bodies becomes important, so that it's not seen as a Western university coming in and experimenting on us. It's seen as something which is more collaborative in nature.
Well, that's happening right now down in South Africa, one of 3 places we're talking about doing this kind of testing. There were some protests recently against this where they said, we are not your guinea pigs. And they're actually coming from this, that, South Africa's had a really dark history of some medical testing down there. How do you address these concerns, Nir, to these communities?
It's important to emphasize these are people who are protesting the conventional efficacy trials that are being conducted this summer. This is not about challenge trials. Challenge trials are currently a theoretical possibility. Challenge trials is something that you don't need to go to a place with a lot of trouble, a lot of ongoing infections at the time of the trial for. One advantage, if you will, ethically, is that you can conduct it wherever. You would presumably conduct it near large research centers, typically in developed countries. You can recruit volunteers. Nobody will recruit, referring to Sarah's point earlier, nobody will recruit somebody with diabetes to such a trial. Everybody, so the WHO working group has now suggested recommendations on this. There's another group that has published in Science on this. Nobody says recruit people who have preconditions that would incline them to have bad COVID outcomes. Everybody says recruit people who are in great health. Some people have even said, not in publications, to me personally, they said maybe we should focus only on white patients because the outcomes tend to be worse for people of color. I'm not sure that I would go there. But if anything, the push is to conduct challenge trials in high-income settings, patients who are highly educated, the people who started the international movement of volunteers we're talking about, which now has 31,000 volunteers and north of that. And remember, these are small trials. We need maybe 150 max people. So the people who started that are Stanford graduates, I think largely white. It's the mirror image of the worry that we're talking about, which may arise about regular efficacy trials. Even there, I would say our main concern right now, sure, we should absolutely engage communities and explain and have great risk communication, but I wouldn't hesitate to conduct a trial if anybody's suggesting that, just because there are some vaccine hesitant 50 protesters in South Africa.
Okay, so I want to bring in a YouTube comment here. It says, how would the mistrust of clinical trials be addressed, especially in the Black community in the U.S.? I talked about South Africa's dark history with medical testing. We certainly have that kind of dark history here in the U.S. as well, especially in the African American community. Let's bring in Glenn Ellis. He's a medical ethicist as part of our community with this comment here.
As a bioethicist, I'm deeply saddened that at this stage of the vaccine development, what we're seeing is that there's no attention being paid to ensuring that there's adequate representation of African Americans in these trials. And we also need to consider who's going to get this vaccine first. If, as the evidence shows, that African Americans are more vulnerable because of existing conditions and chronic diseases, they should be at the front of the line.
Hey, Sarah, we're coming down to our final minute here, but who should get this vaccine first once it's developed? How do you make those decisions?
It's very hard. And I think, unfortunately, we're not seeing much of that discussion happening at the federal level. And that's where it needs to come out of in terms of the guidance, because that's where these vaccines are going to start being available. And we really need to make sure that it's given to the high-risk population first. So not just those that have underlying health conditions and frontline healthcare workers, that's probably a given, but really looking at the higher risk communities, the Black, the Latinos, all the individuals that obviously have been marginalized, and we see that they are much more vulnerable. I think one of the key things I want to also just quickly mention is the equitable distribution of vaccines. No one is safe until everybody is safe. And so we really need to make sure that we need to provide vaccines at the global level. This is a global threat. We can't have a nationalistic approach that we did in 2009, with hoarding vaccines and things like that. We understand every can have their stockpile for their own citizens, but this is really a global health threat, and no one's going to be safe unless everybody has access to this.
We're going to have to leave it there. No one's safe until everyone's safe. This is going to require a global effort. Thank you to our guests so much for today, and this conversation will continue on YouTube. See you next time.